What happens when nearly half of a major oil exporter's capacity is suddenly taken offline during a global energy shock? With about 40% of Russia's crude export system, roughly 2 million barrels per day, disrupted, the situation is no longer regional. It intersects directly with already elevated oil prices above $100 per barrel, creating pressure across global supply chains. This analysis examines how coordinated Ukrainian strikes, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and shifting trade routes are reshaping the energy balance without yet determining whether the disruption will deepen or stabilize. The fundamental shift is from battlefield attrition to economic targeting at scale. If these disruptions persist, Russia's ability to finance its state budget and military operations could weaken materially, given that oil and gas revenues contribute around a quarter of federal income. If the system stabilizes, Moscow may adapt by rerouting exports and reinforcing infrastructure, limiting long-term damage. The outcome determines whether energy becomes the decisive domain of this conflict or remains one of several contested arenas. The roots of this dynamic trace back to the structure of Russia's export network, developed over decades to serve European markets through pipelines and Baltic and Black Sea ports. Since the escalation of the Ukraine war, these routes have become strategic liabilities. Ukraine has increasingly targeted energy infrastructure not only near the battlefield, but deep inside Russian territory, aiming to degrade revenue streams rather than purely military assets. This reflects a broader evolution in modern conflict, where economic infrastructure becomes a primary objective. Power dynamics are defined by asymmetry in reach and vulnerability. Russia maintains large-scale production capacity and diversified export routes, but many of its critical nodes, ports, pipelines, and refineries, are fixed and exposed. Ukraine, lacking comparable energy infrastructure to target in return, focuses on precision drone strikes and disruption tactics. This creates a scenario where relatively low-cost attacks can generate high economic impact, especially when concentrated on bottlenecks. Recent developments illustrate how this strategy has scaled. Ukrainian drone operations have struck all three of Russia's main western export hubs: Novorossiysk on the Black Sea and Primorsk, and Ust-Luga on the Baltic Sea. Together, these ports handle a significant share of seaborne crude exports. Damage to loading infrastructure and storage facilities has reduced throughput, forcing shipments below planned capacity. At the same time, disruptions to the Druzhba pipeline, one of the longest oil pipelines in the world supplying Central Europe, have compounded the impact. The numbers clarify the magnitude. Around 2 million barrels per day of export capacity are currently offline, according to market-based calculations. The Novorossiysk terminal alone can handle up to 700,000 barrels per day, yet it has been operating below capacity following recent strikes. In parallel, tanker seizures linked to sanctions enforcement and geopolitical tensions have removed an additional 300,000 barrels per day of Arctic crude flows from the market, particularly shipments originating from Murmansk. Russia has attempted to compensate by redirecting exports eastward. Pipelines to China, including the Skovorodino-Mohe and Atasu-Alashanko routes, continue to operate, alongside seaborne exports of ESPO blend crude from the port of Kozmino. These eastern channels collectively move about 1.9 million barrels per day. Additional volumes, roughly 250,000 barrels per day, are shipped from Sakhalin projects, while about 300,000 barrels per day continue to supply refineries in Belarus. However, these routes have limited spare capacity, constraining Russia's ability to fully offset Western disruptions. Consider a scenario where Ukrainian strikes intensify and sustain pressure on key export nodes over several months. In this case, cumulative losses in export revenue could significantly affect Russia's fiscal position, forcing adjustments in spending or increased borrowing. Global markets would likely respond with sustained high prices, as supply tightens not only from Middle Eastern instability, but also from reduced Russian output. Energy importing countries would face compounded inflationary pressure, particularly in fuel and transportation sectors. Alternatively, consider a scenario where Russia successfully reinforces its infrastructure and adapts operationally. Enhanced air defenses around ports, rapid repair capabilities, and further diversification of export routes could restore a portion of lost capacity. In this outcome, global markets may stabilize, with prices reflecting risk but not acute shortage. Ukraine's strategy would still impose costs, but without achieving decisive economic disruption. The geopolitical consequences extend beyond immediate supply metrics. Europe, already reducing dependence on Russian energy since 2022, may accelerate diversification efforts further, investing in alternative suppliers and infrastructure. Asian markets, particularly China, could gain leverage by absorbing redirected Russian exports at discounted prices. This shift alters trade flows, potentially entrenching new energy alignments that persist beyond the conflict. At the same time, the situation underscores the vulnerability of centralized export systems. Large-scale infrastructure offers efficiency, but creates critical points of failure. The repeated targeting of ports and pipelines demonstrates how modern warfare increasingly focuses on these nodes. For global energy markets, this introduces a structural risk premium, as traders factor in the possibility of sudden disruptions. Political implications are also significant. Russian authorities have characterized the strikes as attacks on civilian infrastructure and have tightened security across the country's extensive territory. Domestic stability becomes linked to the state's ability to maintain revenue and manage economic pressure. On the Ukrainian side, the strategy reflects an attempt to leverage limited resources for maximum systemic impact, aligning military operations with economic objectives. Ultimately, this situation is defined by thresholds. The threshold at which infrastructure damage translates into sustained export decline. The threshold at which markets shift from volatility to crisis. And the threshold at which economic pressure influences political decision-making. These thresholds are not fixed. They evolve as both sides adapt. Viewers should watch for specific indicators, changes in export volumes from key ports, repair timelines for damaged infrastructure, shifts in tanker traffic patterns, and movements in global oil benchmarks. These signals will reveal whether the disruption is deepening or being contained. In the broader context, the intersection of military strategy and energy systems is becoming increasingly central to global stability. This is no longer only about territorial control, but about controlling flows of resources that underpin entire economies. The outcome will depend not just on battlefield developments, but on how effectively each side manages the economic dimension of the conflict, and how the rest of the world adjusts to the resulting shifts.